Hi, I'm Marianne Lee. I'm here in my writing room and I'm going to read from my debut novel, A Quiet Tide. It's the early 1800s and botanist Ellen Hutchins has been ill for some time, unable to leave the house, and she's now venturing out again to go to her favourite place, which is the waterfall in Glengariff Woods. Someone watched her, eyes boring into her back. She spun around, looked up. Light glittered off the warped glass of the windows. Just then, Kate emerged through the back door, hands on hips, in her blue blouse and skirt, white cap. Ellen waved. Don't worry, all is well. Into the woods, the perpetual twilight. For half an hour she picked her way over tree roots and stray branches, through ferns, nettles, late celandine and stray patches of sunlight. As she approached, she heard the first rushing amidst the trees. When she emerged into the clearing, the full power of it thundered into her ears. She'd pined for this place, even more than the shore. The spray landed on her face and her nostrils filled with the clean rush of moving water. She sat on a fallen tree trunk and idly picked at the rotting wood, setting loose a nest of woodlice across the moss-covered surface. At first glance, the moss seemed amorphous. Looking more closely, she observed its flagiform branchlets, Dicranum flagellare, a miniature world of creation, death, renewal. When she lifted her head again, her vision blackened, pulsing with stars. She steadied herself, one hand on the trunk, waited for it to clear. Then she stood. Slowly the trees came back into focus as the blood settled within her skull. She needed to move. She would walk some of the way towards Glengariff. Out of the woods, the path grew steep and she climbed slowly, sweating, to the foot of the mountain, above the waterfall and along the banks of the river that fed it. She passed a dank cavern, down which trickled a clear, shining thread of spring water. A clump of deep, almost blackish green within caught her eye. She stepped closer, bent over, picked out the individual plant and held it to the meagre light. Tiny, barely 1/8 of an inch across, its leaves edged with spiny-formed teeth. Groping in her pocket, blessed luck, she found her trowel, buried there from a previous outing. She dug out a fair sample, then stood and brushed off her skirt. Time to go back, before Kate sent out a search party and Dan came thrashing through the trees to get her. She hurried, almost slipping on a wet rock, back towards the house. Under the microscope, the plant showed its spherical seeds, covered with opaque dots, probably minute tubercles. Her heart quickened. New treasure, how pleased Mr. Hooker would be. Jack still wouldn't come to church. Each time Leonora asked him to join them, she fretted for his soul. He mocked her. Women's nonsense, he said. I have better to do than listen to children's morality tales. In the carriage on the way to Bantry, Ellen said to Leonora, You know he hasn't left Ballylickey for almost a year. Is it really so long? Leonora shrugged. He is proud. I would not force him. At least he seems happier now you're here, more stable. Stable? The previous week he'd thrown a glass against the wall. During the sermon, she cleared her mind of him and tried to concentrate on the vicar's drone. A shiver trickled down her neck. The church was cold all year round, icy in winter. The thick stone allowed little sunlight to penetrate. Candles were lit either side of the altar, their flames steady and fierce. On the chair next to her, Leonora muttered her prayers, utterly absorbed in some inner dialogue with God. Ellen hadn't yet found this kind of solace in prayer and wondered if she ever would. A tickling in her throat, she swallowed hard to suppress it, coughed quietly into her fist. No use. The spasm clutched at her chest overcame her. She fumbled for her handkerchief and bent double, coughing into it for a minute or more. At last it eased. She stood upright, wiping her eyes. Heads had turned. Her sides ached. She folded away the stained handkerchief, nodded to Leonora. It has passed, and joined in the final prayer, even as her voice cracked. As soon as service ended, a hum of conversation rose. For many of the women, this was the only opportunity for society in the week. Ellen and Leonora filed with the others into the sunshine and stood for a few minutes greeting acquaintances. Reverend Smith approached, extending his arms as if to embrace them. "Miss Hutchins, Mrs. Hutchins, we're glad to see you." "Reverend, a most enjoyable service," Leonora said. He nodded, receiving his due. His pepper-grey hair fuzzed about his head like a dandelion gone to seed. He gazed into the sky and sniffed. "A beautiful day," he said, "though threatening rain. With luck, I'll be home by the time it arrives." He nodded towards his horse where it grazed at the grass verge, a handsome, shining beast donated by Lord Bantry. "I have miles more to travel, 3 more services to conduct before evening." He craned his neck at Ellen. "How long, dear Miss Hutchins, since we last saw you? Months, surely." "We have had illness in the house," Ellen said. "First my mother and my brother, then myself." "I had heard, but hoped not all were afflicted." His little eyes, more cunning than intelligent, scanned Leonora's face, searching for remnants of sickness. Ill colour, sunken cheeks, dull eyeballs, then flicked to Ellen's. She boldly met his stare. "Thank you for your concern, but my mother is recovered now," she said, much her old self. "And your own health?" "I am well, thank you." "I'm glad to hear it." His eyes slid away and he coughed delicately into his hand. "Any news of young Samuel?" "He is in Trinity now, having finished his schooling in England." "Will he come home for the holidays?" "Perhaps," Leonora said. "Well, soon we hope. I'll continue to pray for you." A tight smile on his lean features, he backed away, already nodding at another congregant. "Even the Reverend noticed your coughing," Leonora said. "Dust caught in my throat. It sounded worse than it was." Her mother gave her a sideways look, but said nothing. They came out onto the road and got into the carriage. Spindly trees filtered shafts of early autumn sunlight through the windows, and they winced in the sporadic glare. Leonora said little on the journey. Ellen leaned her head back and let the movement of the wheels shudder through her body. That evening she sat at her writing table by the window facing the sea. She waited, quill in hand, gazing at the shifting colours that changed as the light changed, mirroring the brighter gleam of the sky, reflecting its soft yellows, pinks, purples, and silver blues, filtered through cloud. Her brain cleared, she found the necessary words. Firm, decisive, rueful, with, she hoped, the right note of regret. She was sorry, she said, but she was bound too closely to home to visit Yarmouth at this time. She hoped Mr. Turner might call on her some day, on his way to the mountains of Kerry. It would be nothing to the Turners to have their invitations refused, they who apparently had so many visitors. Disappointment was surely all on her side. Like a fog that seemed to descend after the letter had gone, it lingered far longer than it should have, made all her endeavours seem muted, colourless. Another winter of confinement loomed, as if she entered a dark tunnel. Short, dark days of mist, long nights of howling gales that hurled slates from the roof and knocked trees. Rare days of clear skies and pallid sunshine, though the ground remained bogged underfoot from the quantities of rain. She measured the hours in spent candles and firewood, swaddling herself in shawls and cowering in the rooms of the house kept warm all day, the kitchen and parlour, like an animal in its den. Vegetation shrivelled away, the landscape reduced to an outline of itself, as in an etching by a Dutch master in one of Dr. Stokes's books. Alone in the bleak garden one December morning, pruning back the last season's growth, She heard a sudden cackling din fill the sky. Geese, a flock of dark arrows shooting towards some winter resting ground. She stood open-mouthed, shears in hand, until the last of them disappeared from view.